Yeah, so thank you everyone for coming. I'm just absolutely astounded at the number of people who've signed up for this, so I really hope that it's helpful. And I just wanted to start with the reminder that was also on the um, advertisement that I am not a regulated immigration advisor. So this is just my interpretation of reading the rules, um, yeah, and a little bit of experience. So if you need legal advice, please do pursue that from a regulated immigration advisor. Um, so yeah, just to preface with that. So our agenda for today, which you will have seen, I think, in the emails you got beforehand, we're going to talk a little bit about what it will mean for us to have European missionaries and church workers. We have a mixture of church and parachurch today, I believe. We'll talk a little bit about missions and church work with COVID and having migrants with COVID. We'll talk a little bit about some of the rule changes that have happened and are coming, and then we'll end with a Q&A. So I already have quite a lot of the questions that were sent ahead of time, so I will run through those as quickly as I can, and then we can open it up at the end for anything in the chat document and anything else that people want to ask. So that's the plan for today. I am aiming this talk at people who are already sponsors. So if you aren't already a sponsor and you don't know kind of very much about being a sponsor, some of this might not make a lot of sense. So just to kind of clarify, that's where I'm aiming it at, is people who are already sponsors. And I think from the registration, that's pretty much almost everybody. Yeah, so let's dig into it. So the European settlement scheme. So obviously Brexit is having a massive impact on, yeah, every part of our society, but in particular on what it means for Europeans to be able to live and work here. And it's taken a really long time to figure out what the actual rules are going to be. And as far as I know, everything will actually be officially published on the 1st of December. So at the moment, the rules aren't officially published. So some of this stuff that we're talking about is kind of from different publications and change statements that have come out, but nothing is in the actual immigration rules as of today. So I don't think anything big would change, since it's a very long process to make these changes happen. But just to say that, yeah, that's the position that we're in. Yeah. So the European settlement scheme, hopefully everybody has heard about this, and any current European missionaries and church workers that you have already registered for this. So it opened March of 2019. So it's been open for quite a long time. So any Europeans who moved here before the 31st of December, so in another month and a bit, they're allowed to apply for this settlement scheme. And they have until June of next year to complete that application, but they have to arrive before the 31st of December. So over 4 million people have already applied for this scheme, and almost all of those have been accepted. It's free to apply and everything is done online. So it's a pretty easy process. They aren't making it difficult. And there are 2 different statuses that people can get. So you can get settled status. So if a European has been here for 5 years or longer, they get a settled status, which is basically another name for indefinite leave to remain, or ILR. So they're allowed to do any kind of work, any kind of education, and stay as long as they want. And after 1 year, they're allowed to apply for citizenship. Let me just see. Yes. Oh, I do have a slide on this. And then pre-settled status is the only other option that you have within the European settlement scheme. So anyone who hasn't been here for the full 5 years, they'll be given status up to that 5-year point. Then they apply for settled status, then they can qualify for citizenship. So if they've been here 3 years, they'll get a 2-year pre-settled visa to get them to the full 5 years. So again, they're allowed to do any kind of work, do any kind of education. Everyone on the European settlement scheme can access the NHS, they can claim benefits, they can live here essentially as they were before. It's just that they have to have this status. So as you know, we have to have a right to work document for everybody that works for us, whether they're British or migrant. And so previously a European could just use their European passport or a residency card, but now they're going to have prove this status for you to be allowed to employ them. So yeah, hopefully you've already got all of your European people to apply for this status. It's really easy and allows them to do everything. So it's, yeah, it's been really good so far from what we've seen. Yeah, so that's the European settlement scheme. It's not a lot of information for you in some ways because it's pretty simple, and I think we haven't had too much trouble with YWAMers getting registered for it and getting that sorted out. So the next section is the new points-based system. Obviously, that's kind of a misleading term to call it a new points-based system because we have already got a very robust points-based system in operation, as everyone here will be aware of. It's basically some new categories within the points-based system. So yeah, so Europeans arriving from January 2020, so from, I think it's actually 11 o'clock on the 31st of December, but who's arriving at midnight on New Year's Eve, I don't know. So Europeans will now have to have some kind of visa. So they've created some new categories called the skilled worker, the skilled healthcare worker, and global talent. So those are the three new categories. And basically it's just for people who are highly educated or have really kind of quite specialist skills for certain types of jobs. So there won't be anything offered that would fall into these categories that would be, like, say, at minimum wage. That won't be happening. It's all highly skilled workers. The government has been very clear that they are not looking to allow low skilled workers into the UK really for almost any reason. It's going to have to be the high skills. So as yet, I haven't been able to determine which category they're going to fall in terms of, I suspect there'll be a tier 2 skilled worker and a tier 5 skilled worker, but I don't know that for sure. They haven't released which tier number it's going to be categorized, but I would assume that there would be a temporary version and a permanent version, similar to how we have a tier 5 religious worker temporary role and a tier 2 minister of religion, which is a more permanent role. But again, don't quote me on that one. Sorry, just have to check. I'm following my notes a little bit here. Yeah, so from December 1st, all of the rules will be published for all of these, the three new categories. But a lot of what we know about it has been put out in the statement of changes that are coming, and there's been quite a few emails sent out to sponsors about which changes are coming and how they'll affect sponsors. So it's not 100% revealed yet how it will look, but quite a lot of it we can, we can see how it's going to work. So similar to how our tier 2 minister of religion and tier 5 religious worker go, you need points. So a minister of religion needs 70 points and a religious worker needs 40 points. So I believe it's 70 points again. So this is kind of an intense screen, and I will share this PowerPoint out, so don't worry about trying to write all this down. This is just a summary for you to be able to see. So you need all these points, but some of the categories are tradable. So you might have a slightly lower income, but a higher education. So there's some things that you can sort of slide around, where in our tier 2 minister of religion, 70 points, nothing is tradable. You have to have exactly what they say or you don't get it. So it's something quite different that there's these tradable or flexible points, as they're calling it. But it's some of the same kind of things. You need to have an approved sponsor. You need to speak English at a certain level, which I thought was interesting, that from tier 2 minister of religion, you have to speak at level, it's called B2, and you only have to have B1 for the skilled workers. So your English doesn't have to be quite as good for the new skilled worker categories. You have to have a certain skill level for these new points-based systems. So what did they refer to it as? The RQF3, which I do not know what that means, but it's basically an A-level category or higher. So yeah, so that's something that's a little bit different that obviously we won't have experienced in our main two categories before now. So yeah, so that's just to kind of show you a little bit about the points. All this is available on the link. So I think I put, yeah, so on this slide, there's the link about where to find out all this information that I've just put there. So you can easily find that again. So if you're already a sponsor with the Tier 2 general category, it sounds like they're just gonna add that to your sponsor license. But if you don't already have Tier 2 general, you will have to go ahead and apply for that to be added to your license. Yeah, and the UKVI, it sounds like they're just going to decide how many people get. So it may be that in some cases you'll have to ask for, if you're going to use it, that you'll need to ask for an increase in allocation if they only give you 1 and you need 5, for example. But that's a little bit unclear how it will exactly function. Yeah, and thanks to Tim Herbert or Hebert, we've recently been talking about this and trying to figure out how do you add different categories to your sponsor license. And just to say as a heads up, it's not through your SMS, but it's through the sponsor license portal or license application portal. So if you're wanting to add this to your license, don't look for it in the SMS. So in the new categories, so the skilled worker, skilled healthcare worker, and global talent, you'll have to pay the £1,000 immigration surcharge as the sponsor. So that's a big amount. And so that's £1,000 for the first 12 months, and then it's an additional £500 for any subsequent 6-month period. So it could be if you're wanting to hire someone for 3 years, you're looking at many thousands of pounds in the immigration surcharge cost, but there are discounted rates for charities and small businesses. So if any of you are charities, which probably all of us are, there are discounts, but I haven't seen published what the actual amount is. Again, I can't tell you how expensive the new visa is going to be. If my guess is correct that there will be a Tier 2 and a Tier 5 category, I would assume it would be a similar costing. So that's currently £244 for a Tier 5 and £704 for a Tier 2. They'll also have to pay the NHS surcharge, which is now £624 per year per person. So yeah, so I'm assuming that, but I haven't seen anything published on how expensive they'll exactly be. Europeans that come on this route won't have to do biometrics in person. It will all be by phone, the same as the European settlement scheme. But any non-Europeans coming on this route will still have to do biometrics. So that's something that's a little bit different between the two categories of migrants. And again, I don't know the price. I don't know how long they're going to last for, what categories. I don't know if it's going to be a 2-year, a 3-year. I'm not sure how long the visa will last for when you apply for it. So again, if I have guessed correctly, I would assume there'll be a 2-year version and a 3 up to 5-year version that leads to settlement the same way as Tier 2s do. So yeah, so that's in a nutshell, that is a really quick version of the new categories for for Europeans, and well, it's for everybody, but they're rolling it out in timing with some of the Brexit stuff. So that's probably sounds really overwhelming to a lot of you. I've had a lot of emails asking me about how are we going to pay for the immigration surcharge and how do we meet the minimum salary requirements. And the great news is that I'm pretty sure you don't have to, because what I believe is going to happen, and what has been published, is that Europeans will now just be rolled into the whole points-based system. So this current points-based system that we've all been using started in 2008. Before that, there was a completely different system. But religious work is considered what's called a specialist occupation. So that means anyone coming to do religious work can be invited as a Tier 2 minister of religion or a Tier 5 religious worker. For those of you who are wondering where I got that from, It was from a government website, not just from some lawyers somewhere, but point 21, where you see the arrow there, the specialist occupation specifically includes the religious roles. So that means we don't have a salary minimum and we don't have to pay the immigration surcharge. So that's the two really great pieces of news that I really hope everybody feels encouraged about if you weren't already convinced that this was happening. As far as I'm concerned, if they're coming to do religious work, they will qualify to come under the categories we've been using. So yeah, this was the main piece of news that I wanted everyone to definitely leave feeling convinced about. So all jobs need what's called a SOC code. If you're using the SMS, you will have seen that. It's a shortage occupation code, which is produced by the Office for National Statistics. So it's not updated particularly often, but there is one religious code, 2444 clergy. So that would be the code, I would say. Some of you may be using other codes for a little while. YWAM used a youth and community workers code. But if you're particularly inviting people on a religious one, clergy is it. And I did a little bit of a deep dive into the Office for National Statistics publication of the SOC codes that the UKVI just uses what they produce. And under the same code, which is called clergy, it also specifically lists missionary, evangelist, monk, nun. I think they even had some kind of like spiritualist healer listed in it. So it's actually quite a bit broader than just clergy. So we use that code for all of our religious workers, even if they're not, well, for YWAM, because we're not leading churches, we don't have any clergy working, serving with YWAM. But just to say that that is the one religious code, but it encapsulates a lot more. Yeah. So Europeans arriving from January 2020 will pay the same visa fees that all of our migrants up till now have been paying. They'll have the same access to the NHS for paying that. They'll get their biometrics done, the same as all of our migrants have had to do up until now. But it's a big mindset change for Europeans to have to go through all of this to come to what has traditionally been a place where they can just come and work for free. So it is going to be a big change, I think, to help support our European missionaries and church workers to go through to make the shift. So yeah, it's a pretty straightforward online system. So far as I'm aware, we have a lot of migrants go through it that are very successful. So yeah, that's yeah, I think it will probably require more pastoral support and communication rather than that it's going to be a lot of support for Europeans to actually fill out the forms. So I'm just going to go on a little bit of a rabbit trail just for a second here, because I get a lot of questions about how much we have to pay people who come on these categories, because there's a minimum salary for a lot of the roles. And yeah, we just get a lot of questions about that. So I'm just going to go on a little rabbit trail just while we're talking about the tier 2 and tier 5 categories. So there's lots of confusion, I think, for people about the term supernumerary and the term resident labor market test. So I'm just going to do a quick definition of that. So if you are advertising for paid specific roles, you can tune out for 2 minutes. This is just for people who are hiring or bringing in unpaid roles, and that you can take as many people as you want. So the term supernumerary basically just means surplus to extra. So within the context of YWAM, for example, if 10 qualified people apply to come as missionaries to one of our teams, we can take 10. And if 5 apply, we can take 5. It doesn't matter what nation they're from, as long as they're qualified, we can take everybody. And additionally, within that, it means that we fit the role to the person. So for example, I lead the YWAM team that I'm a part of in Wrexham in Wales. I do the visa coordinating for England and Wales. I support a vulnerable person, and I volunteer at a kids club. So if I leave YWAM, they're not going to hire somebody to do those exact roles. Somebody will probably do all those things, but it wouldn't be one person. We shift our roles around to fit the people that we bring in. So those are the two main things that you have to keep in mind about supernumerary, that you can take as many as you want, as many as apply that are qualified, and you fit the role around the person. So those are the two main, factors on that. So then the resident labor market test, if you're bringing people in on a paid role and you need to advertise for it because it's a specific role that has to be filled for your organization, you are required to perform the resident labor market test, which is advertising in a particular way on particular sites for a particular amount of time. But if you have only supernumerary roles, then you don't have to perform the resident labor market test. So so that's something that's happening. They are abolishing the resident labor market tests shortly from the 1st of January. It's not going to exist anymore because that £1,000 immigration surcharge is deterrent enough for most organizations. So they're not going to have that mandated, because if you have to pay £1,000 or more to hire somebody from abroad, you're probably going to put in the effort to try and find a British person to do the job first, is the theory. So just to say, there's lots of questions that YWAM gets about, do you really not pay anybody? And we really don't pay any of our missionaries. And we are bringing in 200 to 250 missionaries a year, and we've never paid anybody. So you definitely, if you're running supernumerary roles, you don't have to pay people. You really have to dive deep into the national minimum wage rules to find all of that, but it's definitely allowed not to pay people. So if you are paying people for specific roles, you do have to meet the salary minimum though. So that's our, just trying to make sure I'm sticking to the time frame that I want. So, so that's the bit about resident labor market tests and supernumerary. So just jumping back to the new skilled workers category, I struggled a little bit to imagine what roles any of you would have that wouldn't fall into the religious category, since as far as I'm aware, all of us would be either a church or a registered Christian charity with charitable objectives that would include things like sharing the gospel or doing things because of a religious belief system. So I struggle a little bit to imagine what roles people would have that would need to come on the skilled worker role and couldn't come as ministers of religion or religious workers. But if there are some of those, just to make sure that you get it added to your sponsor license, to make sure you have that added in time for when you want to invite people on it, that you're ready to pay that immigration surcharge and to meet the salary requirements and the other qualifications for the roles, in terms of you might then need to say that people have to have some kind of degree, religious degree, for example, to meet the role, which you don't have to do for the minister of religion or religious worker. So so that's, if there are particularly questions about this aspect of using the new system versus the system we've all been using for religious roles, to make sure to type that now into the shared documents, and we can definitely come back around to that in the question and answer time. But that's kind of the big picture of it, for now. So I hope people are feeling encouraged that they can keep using a system, the old system, that's not so expensive for us. That's a big relief for YWAMers, at least. So I hope it's good news for everybody. So from here, we're going to move to talk a little bit about COVID and what does it mean to do the kinds of work that we do and have migrants that are already here with us and recruiting new migrants when there's a pandemic. So obviously a lot of things changed for everybody. And it was particularly maybe complicated for migrants. Obviously, yeah, living away from home during something like a pandemic is a challenge. Um, so for lots of us, for those of you who are representing churches here, places of worship have been closed or significantly limited. Um, yeah, the types of ministries that can be run in a pandemic changes. So some of the stuff that we were doing probably got canceled or changed or closed down or adjusted. And then other things that we've been doing, for example, my husband volunteers at our local Trussell Trust food bank. That got very busy and took up a lot more time rather than the less time that some of us will have experienced, depending on the type of ministries that we were doing. Yeah, so yeah, and there's so many different categories of rules as well to make sure that we've been following through all of this. There are the rules that the UKVI is putting out about how to handle migrants. There's rules about social distancing and masks for any kind of ministry that you run. If you have a church, a certain number of people and how you can offer services. For different ministries, making sure that you're meeting all the requirements. YWAM runs a lot of residential training where we bring people in to live on our site and be trained. So then there's all kinds of rules that could fall into the business or charity categories, into the home category since people are living on site. There's a residential schools and schools category that we have to think about in terms of a classroom. So there's a lot of different categories that will be affecting us rule-wise to make sure that we're familiar with. And yeah, something that I found challenging is that to find the actual rules isn't that easy, and they're written in your typical government rule language, so it's not always super clear what they mean. So it's taken a lot of effort to make sure to find out that we are all following the rules we need to. But as far as migrants go, the main messaging has been from the beginning, if you can go home and not be here illegally, please do that. If you can't, here's a set of rules to follow. So yeah, and that message has been the same right from the very beginning. When they started adjusting the rules in March to today, they're still saying, please don't become an overstayer. If it's possible to leave, you need to leave. But obviously there are some countries that still have their borders completely closed. So somebody that's here and their visas run out, they may not actually be able to return to their home nation at this point. So it does get complicated, and there are some categories for that. But so a lot of the changes that we saw happen were between March and August of 2020. So the UKVI was a little bit slow out of the gate to let people know what the actual changes were, but then they did, in my opinion, a really good job of communicating, sending out emails regularly to the sponsors about what the changes were and how to handle them. So I really appreciated that, because the UKVI is not traditionally great at communicating to sponsors about what's happening and what's changing. So just a summary of some of the rules that were changed at the time were that migrants could miss up to 60 days of work for pandemic related reasons, and we didn't have to report them. So obviously that's a massive change, because normally it's 10 days of missed work or 4 weeks of unpaid work. So that was a big change that made it a lot easier. For example, the migrant on my team, she does almost exclusively urban missions, kind of supporting families and homeless and stuff that just shut down. A lot of the ministry she did was just shut down. So she absolutely couldn't meet her full-time work hours, 40 hours a week. Wasn't possible for her because everything was closed. And there's only so much praying and intercession and worship she could do at our house before that became a little bit trying, you know, 3, 4, 5 months on. And so she really struggled to meet her hours. So that was really helpful for me, that she could miss some time where she didn't have to work the expected hours because of that. Automatic extensions were given to anyone who applied, so emailing or contacting the COVID helpline. The dates shifted all the time, so it had to be that your visa ran out at this time, and then they would shift it, your expiry date, to another time. And that happened a couple of times where they moved it along for people to be able to leave and not be considered an overstayer, even if their visa expired. But they would need to have some sense of like that flights were being canceled or their home country wasn't open. So for example, I'm a Canadian and I could have flown home. It might have been complicated and challenging, but I could actually get into my country. So I would still be expected to leave unless I was self-isolating or sick. One thing that was really helpful for YWAM, at least, was that in-country switching became allowed. So normally it's pretty limited how you can switch between visas unless you're on a tier 4, which is the student visa category. So we had some people that were able to switch from their tier 5 visa into the tier 2 category without having to go home. And that was massively convenient for us. And that is still being allowed in certain circumstances. There is some switching that's still allowed, but they're not. There's some mixed messaging about what switching is allowed and what isn't. But basically, you have to be able to prove, and the sponsor needs to say that it's urgent that the person will start or stay in the job that they're doing to switch. So we have had a few people apply after they sort of reverted the rules back, and we still haven't heard if all of them have been successful, but we've had a lot of people switch, and it's been pretty easy. Obviously, it saves a lot of money. Obviously, there were massive delays in visa processing, in sponsor license processing, in every kind of thing, because the visa application centers, the VACs, were closed everywhere during the first peak, March to May. A lot of them were closed. And as they've started to open back up, things are picking up in the timeline, but it's still, we still have people waiting months and months after, and then others that have gone through really quickly. And I don't know what that's down to, but the timelines have been massively affected. So I don't know how long it's going to take. The UKVI is boldly proclaiming that everything is back to normal, but by experience, I can tell you that it's absolutely not back to normal. And most people are still waiting a much longer time for visas. So a small category of people, even for us, bringing in such a big number of migrants each year, was people who had applied for a visa and then couldn't come to the UK because of flights or pandemic related reasons. And that created just a little bit of extra paperwork for people needing to apply either for a change of circumstance to get that little sticker, the vignette that goes into the passport, the 30-day window that they can enter the UK on. To get that changed and updated required a bit of reporting on our side as sponsors for new start dates and that kind of thing, but it was still possible. The UKVI made it really easy to just shift the dates as long as you did the paperwork correctly. Again, that has been massively delayed. We have some people that are waiting 3 and 4 months on just for the change of circumstance and the new vignette to come through. So we have some people that are massively delayed, months and months delayed in coming. Biometrics was another thing that was changed that was actually really convenient for a lot of our people. Anyone who was extending a visa, switching in country, applying for ILR or citizenship, biometrics were able to be done by digital means rather than having to go to an appointment. So that saved a lot of time and effort, as long as you had a phone that would get the app to do all of the digital side of things correctly. But that made a big difference for a lot of our people and sped up the timeline. Yeah, for some of our people that in particular switching in country if they'd submitted biometrics previously. That is switched back now, although we have heard about a few people still being asked to do it digitally when we would have expected them to have an appointment. So I assume they're still trying to clear some of the backlog there. And another thing that, depending on how you feel about them, is a good thing or a bad thing, the UKVI wasn't doing inspections of sponsors. So yeah, as far as I know, there haven't been any inspections, and I don't know if they've restarted them yet. Yeah, it's a little bit hit and miss how frequently they do them. YWAM used to get them every 2 years, and then I had 2 in a row, and then I haven't had one for 2 years now. So I don't really know what to tell you about how frequently you might expect them to be, but I would have thought I should be getting one soon if they're doing them. But we know sponsors that have gone 4 years without an inspection. So it's a mystery. But we found navigating this really complicated as a mission, because not only were the rules all changing that we had to keep up with, but then pastorally supporting our migrants with, do they go home and do they stay? And we have a lot of residential, like a lot of our missionaries live on our YWAM locations, on our bases. So creating, whole new systems for people to operate in, and just supporting all of those changes. It was really complicated. And some of our people got way busier because they were doing the types of ministries that were essential or key services provided to a community. And some people were twiddling their thumbs and thinking, well, what am I going to do with my day? I wanted to be here doing missions and I can't do any of the stuff I came to do. It was a big change. And for a lot of our locations, mainly it was a financial cost, because a lot of migrants then obviously didn't come during the summer when we might have had another 100 people join us. We didn't have anybody join us in that time. And a lot of our bases are functioning and run based on a big number of people paying the bills for the buildings to be open and that kind of thing. So I know the impact was massive. For so many people, so many teams, not just the YWAM locations. But now the rules are mostly back to normal for COVID. There is a much more relaxed approach to when migrants need to pick up their BRPs or get registered with the police if they're required to do that, because obviously many nations have to quarantine for 14 days when they enter the UK, which means you can't pick up your BRP within 10 days or get registered with the police right away. But they have now officially published that you should quarantine first if required. And the post office is now keeping the BRPs longer. So just to say, we had one of our people, an immigration officer in an airport, said you need to pick up your BRP first, which isn't true. That's not what the UKVI is saying. So even if someone in an airport tells your migrants that they should do their self-isolation first and then get their BRP. And an ongoing change is that overstayers, there's not going to really be any consequences for that. So they're not going to be pursuing criminal action or deporting people pretty much for any reason. They do want people to go home, but they aren't putting the time and effort into tracking all of that down. So I think if you have people who are overstaying and it's been difficult and they've tried their best, I think you can tell them not to worry too much. It's not going to impact them negatively in terms of their future immigration hopes. I already talked a little bit about that they're still allowing some aspects of switching in country. So you just have to make sure you're reading whatever the current rules are to see if that particular scenario was allowed, because they keep changing the dates on, if your visa expires between these dates, then you can apply. So to just make sure that anyone you're wanting to bring in. So on the PowerPoint, you'll see there's a sponsor landing page link and an applicant landing page link. So obviously it's slightly different information between those two things, but to make sure you're checking them frequently, because they're still updating the rules, not every week like they were, but it's still pretty frequent that they're adjusting things and adding that, in particular stuff related to dates. So now, instead of extending a visa and making the expiry date different, what they're offering now is something they're calling exceptional assurance. So it isn't a visa extension, but it does allow you to stay in the UK if you can't get home. So I would recommend, if you have people who cannot leave, whose visa has expired, that they need to get in touch with the COVID helpline and get this exceptional assurance status. And then if anything changes, they need to renew that exceptional assurance. So just to make sure that you're doing that. They describe it as short-term protection against adverse action or consequences. So it just, basically it's due diligence. It's letting the government know that you're trying, but you can't leave. So yeah, and if you had, basically you're allowed to keep doing your job or your education if you have the status. So it just means people can kind of keep working with you until they can leave. Just checking my notes to make sure I've covered everything. So as far as I know, most rules are back to normal. Most visa application centers are open worldwide. This slide here is just, in case you don't have it, it's a short link to the email address and the phone number for the Corona helpline. We found that they're broadly helpful when we've emailed or our applicants have emailed to ask specific questions. Yeah, and for anyone that you have new that's coming, I just recommend making sure you do a check that the visa application center that's local to them is open. They are still allowing people to, like if, for example, you have a Brazilian coming and the Brazil VACs are closed, they can apply through a nearby nation. I mean, Brazil is huge. I should have picked a different option, maybe in Central America somewhere where the countries are all squashed together. You could still apply in a nearby country instead, which is typically not allowed. So just to make sure you're checking the specific nationalities of your new people. So a personal prediction that I would be making about pandemics and how things are going now, obviously we're well into, I guess, a second peak, and things are pretty bad here at the moment, but we aren't seeing the same level of changes that we saw in March, April, and May. So a lot of the visa centers are still open and they were closed for months on end. So I think things won't go back to the extreme changes that we saw before, even if things stay bad for a while. Obviously, I think we are all hoping and praying that some of these vaccines are successful and rolled out quickly and we see a return to normal-ish life, sometime next year. But if not, I think the changes will remain kind of as they are now, slightly modified, but most countries you can get back to, and they are expecting you. Like obviously, if I'm inviting a new migrant, they're aware of the global situation. And if they're thinking they're going to come, but then need to go home again right away, hopefully to talk that through ahead of time and that people aren't going to come that will then need to want to go home. And YWAM, we run a lot of training for young people, between the ages of 18 and 25. And what 18-year-old wants to live abroad in the midst of a global connection? So we had global pandemic. So we had a lot of our people that were in the midst of our training programs. They went home in the first one, but the person that would come to one now is probably someone that would stay. So that's why I think they're not going to make the rules as extreme as they were again, because people were recruiting now in the midst of the context that we're in. But that's just my opinion about how they're doing things rather than something that's been published from the government. So yeah, so that's coronavirus and being a mission in a pandemic. I think the only thing I can encourage everybody to do is just make sure you're really reading through the rules that they send out to the sponsor. So I think it's just the authorizing officer and the key contact that we're getting those emails, but to make sure you're disseminating those out to anyone that needs to be reading that so that everybody knows what rules are, affecting them as things develop and change. But they've done a really good job, the UKVI, of providing the change information, which I found, really helpful. So, So, even a few minutes ahead of time where I hoped to be now. So that's good, a bit more time for questions at the end. So I'm just going to run through now some of the changes that have happened and some of the changes that are coming up. There are loads of other things, but I'm just going to talk about ones that have either impacted us or that I can imagine have impacted other Christian charities and mission groups. This in a similar way to how they've affected us. So in January 2019, a 12-month cooling off period was introduced for the Tier 5 category of visas. So that's including the religious worker and the charity worker, which are the two I believe that most everyone here would be using. And this was a big change for us, for example, because we had a lot of people that were coming on consecutive Tier 5s. For a variety of reasons. Either they couldn't pass the English test, or the cost was prohibitive to switch to a Tier 2, or they weren't willing to make a long-term commitment. They would only commit for another year or two at a time. So we continued them in a temporary visa holding patterns. We had people on 3 and 4 consecutive tier 5 visas. So it made a big change for us in terms of our recruitment. And I know it's affected a lot of other agencies, mission agencies in the same way. Yeah, so we had to shift kind of our who qualified for a tier 2. Generally speaking, as YWAM, we're still bringing people in initially on a tier 5 visa and then switching them to a tier 2 in the long run. And for all of our training and our really short-term commitment stuff, it's definitely a tier 5 still. We're still a little bit reluctant to give out too many tier 2s, but that's worked okay for us up till now. You know, some people we have, if they're just doing a 6-month training with us, they'll come on a tier 5, and then sometimes they'll just extend that to the 2 years and serve with us as a missionary for another 18 months and then come back on a tier 2, which before we would have, handled that a little bit differently. So yeah, we've just had to sort of switch our language from temporary roles to more permanent roles and shifting people when they're changing visas. So that was a massive change, I think, for us and for many. So another change that happened in May of 2019, so we're still looking back like a year and a half at this point, but I only realized the impact of it somewhat recently, is that they introduced the electronic passport gates for quite a few nations, which meant loads of our people weren't getting a stamp on their temporary entry vignette, 30-day sticker in their passport. And that's one of the pieces in Appendix D, which is like the definitive, the Bible of what you have to keep for your records for your migrants. That's one of the things you have to keep, is that entry stamp. And so they've changed the rules to say that if somebody comes in, so Canadians and Americans are in that category, which at least for YWAM, that's a pretty big percentage of our people. They can come through and they weren't seeing an immigration officer, they were just going through the system. So now instead of getting the stamp, you're allowed to see a copy of an itinerary or a boarding pass, and then just write the date that they entered the UK onto your copy of the BRP or the passport that you have to keep in your files. And you don't have to have a copy of their boarding pass. You're allowed to have a copy, but you don't have to have a copy as long as you write the date somewhere on it when you get your photocopy. So that's a big change, is that was a really key piece of evidence that you were required to have, that they really looked for in the inspection. So So another really useful change, in my opinion, is that the English tests have changed a little bit. So obviously this only applies to our tier 2 migrants, that they have to pass an English test to the level of B2. And there was only 2 for a long time, but they've recently approved that there are now 4 different schools. I'm not sure what the right term for it is, but where you can do the test, a certified test. So there's one more international and one more UK-based group that can offer the certified English test. So instead of 2, there's now 4. So there's, of course, different scoring systems for all of them, and all of that's published, how they refer to their, whatever their number is or system is that meets the B2 level that tier 2 migrants have to have. But it is just a few more locations and places where you can do it, which is great. And just to say, something that's caught YWAM out recently is that in the past, the rules weren't clear, and anyone with an average of the score, so there's the 4 categories that you have to meet within the English test, and if you had an average of the required score, you would get your visa. But I don't know when they updated the rules, but the rules are now very clear that you have to have the required score in each of the categories. So we did have a migrant caught out in what we knew to be a system that was functional. Almost all of our migrants had the average score, but not necessarily the individual required scores. So you really need to be checking that their English test meets the requirements, because they will be denied if they don't have the minimum in each category. So we've had a couple of migrants that have had to do the test 3 or 4 times in order to be successful. So some of them might have a really high score in one category and a low one in another, and they just really have to keep working at it. So so that's been challenging, that they are now really enforcing that where they didn't used to. And obviously the least useful change that's happened just recently in October of 2020 is that the NHS surcharge has gone up once again. So it was 200, then it was 400, and now it's £624 per year per person. So I was just calculating the costs for a family of 4 to renew their tier 2 visa, and it's £10,000 between the 4 visa costs at £704 each, plus the £624 for 3 years for 4 people, and it was £10,000. So that's a massively prohibitive thing. It's almost as expensive for 1 year of NHS access as it is for the visa. So it's a fundraising challenge for a lot of, for YWAM's migrants at least, and I would assume for a proportion of some of yours as well, that NHS surcharge is so high. So tell them to go and get an eye exam and see their GP and take advantage of the system if they've paid for it. So we've had some trouble with our migrants getting registered with local GPs. So they should just make sure they take in that evidence that they've paid for the surcharge. It's a system that's working a lot better now that it's a couple of years old, but at the beginning it was really hit and miss if the GPs knew about it at all, let alone would accept the paper evidence that our migrants took to say, no, I can definitely access your care. So just to make sure that, yeah, your people can get registered with their GP. Yeah. So a couple of upcoming immigration rule changes that we know about is that they are talking about removing the 30-day vignette in the passport and making that a digital process instead, which would mean people don't need to send their passports in with their applications. So that would be a really beneficial change if they bring it out. I was part of a research group answering questions about this, and it sounded like it would be really great, but there's no timeline for it. I think it got a bit lost in all of the pandemic rule changes and the Brexit rule changes. So I'm assuming that will come out at some point, but it hasn't, there hasn't been a date assigned to when that change would happen. I already mentioned when we talked a little bit about resident labor market tests that is being abolished on the 1st of January. That's been in the works for a long time to take that out. So the main change, I think, for most of us is that if you're using the supernumerary status, you were exempt from running the resident labor market test. So you just don't need to refer to the resident labor market test anymore, because before you had to say why you were exempt. So obviously you won't have to do that anymore, but you can still have supernumerary roles, which allows you not to pay people, and that they can be self-funded. But again, the exact rules on that aren't produced yet. So for example, in our guarantee letter that we give people with their certificate to submit with their application, for YWAMers, we really lay it out because we've had trouble with a variety of immigration officers not understanding the supernumerary status because it's not that common, and visas getting refused because of it. So we have quite a lengthy explanation in our guarantee letter. So I'm looking forward to getting to remove all of that from our explanation. So so that will be good, but probably fairly low impact for most of us that is coming up. For those of you that are advertising for paid specific roles that need to be filled, it will just tighten up your timeline for inviting people, that you won't have that 4-week advertising period anymore. You just pay your fee and then you can invite somebody. So that will be nice. And another change that we know of that's coming up is with the youth mobility worker category. So this is one where the government essentially is the sponsor. We encourage YWAMers to come on the youth mobility worker or the ancestry or the family route if they're able, because then if we lost our license, they wouldn't be affected. But they're talking about adding a few more nationalities to the youth mobility worker category, which would just mean a few more people might be able to come. It's a temporary visa, so it's a 2-year visa, and they can do any kind of work and any kind of education. So it may be that that works for your 18 to 30-year-old people with no kids. So it's kind of a narrow category in some ways, but there's a certain number for each country. Like South Korea, for example, has 5,000 per year that they can give out, and they disappear in a heartbeat. If you don't get in January on it, you might not get one from South Korea. But New Zealand has 20,000 of these a year to give out. So it's much easier for New Zealanders to get this type of visa. But they're talking about adding, I don't remember which nations it is now, but so that's one change that might be coming up. And the last one, which I forgot to add to the slide, is about standard visitors. And I'm a little bit still unclear on exactly how this change will work. But before, standard visitors were only allowed to do incidental volunteering. So if someone came to the country as a tourist and they met a YWAMer, for example, or someone from your church or your charity, and they wanted to help out at your food bank for a day, they could do that. They didn't need a visa to do that. But if their real reason for coming to the UK was to work at your food bank with you, then they need a visa for that. But within the standard visitor, they're removing that term of incidental from the 1st of January. And so it looks like it means that people could come for up to 30 days and just volunteer with you, even if it's their primary reason for coming to the UK. So that might be a small category of people for you, or it might open things up. Something that's been hard for YWAM with standard visitors, for example, is that for both religious worker and charity worker, there's quite a lot of things prohibited that you can't do on it. Charity workers can't do maintenance or finances or things to fix a building. So there's quite a lot of things they're not allowed to do, which for us, if we wanted to bring somebody in to just do maintenance for the summer, we couldn't do that on a charity worker visa. But we also couldn't have them on a religious worker visa because mowing the lawn isn't really religious work, at least according to how it would look to a immigration inspector or someone who's looking at our files and interviewing a migrant. I don't think they would categorize it as religious work, even if the person did it, do everything you do as unto the Lord. So that was a complicated category for us if we wanted to have volunteers come and just do practical work. So this 30-day allowance for volunteering could make a difference for us for some short-term people. But just to flag that up, there's a chance that it might just be for Europeans, but it might be for everybody. That is still unclear, and we will know after they publish the rules I believe it's going to be on the 1st of December. So yeah. And just as a heads up, I had an email, hopefully all of you've gotten it already if you're sponsors. The IT system is going to be down, so the SMS won't be available from the 27th to the 1st. And it sounds like there's going to be stuff like if you're halfway through something, they're just going to delete it or cancel it. So just as a heads up, they're saying to everyone to either complete any action that you've got or wait to do it until the 2nd of December. So that's just a pro tip from an email that I had from the UK VI to make sure that you don't get caught out on that. I assume that's adding in the new skilled worker categories and producing some of the rule changes. So we're coming up to the very end of where I'm doing this part of talking. We're going to switch to the Q&A right away. So this is just a really quick link. These are my most visited sites. So I think if you haven't bookmarked these websites, if you're the main person doing visas at your site, to make sure that you really know these, in particular Appendix D and the sponsor guidance. I am constantly in those two documents. So if you're not really familiar with them, make sure you are. Those are the really key spots. And the other thing that I would say is the main way that I stay on top of the rules is that I've subscribed to these emails. So this is not necessarily easy to find, but this is the way I stay on top of it. And if you haven't done it, go through the gov.uk website and find any page like this one, immigration rules, and subscribe to email alerts. And then you can say if you want to get it every day, every week, whenever there's a change, and they just send you a link with all of the web pages that have been changed. And that is the only way I've stayed up on a lot of the changes that have been rolled out. So this is a massive pro tip for you. Get subscribed to the emails if you haven't already. So yeah. So I'm going to try and run through super quickly some of the questions that were sent in ahead of time, and then we'll leave some space for more questions at the end, if that's okay. Sorry, you were probably starting to hit your like fill point for lots and lots of information. Yeah, so we'll try and keep it simple. So some of you may already know the answers to these questions, so just pay attention to the ones that you want to hear. So one person asked, what are the main mistakes sponsors make to lose their license? So from experience, poor record keeping. That is the number one reason we've seen sponsors struggle. And in 2015, there was a series of inspections that happened for lots of different organizations, but within the framework of what I'm talking about today, there were several charities, including YWAM, that were either downgraded to a B and almost lost their license, or did lose their license through that series of inspections in 2015. And it was pretty much 100% down to poor record keeping. We weren't staying on top of the rules. We didn't have the right papers and files. We weren't keeping things up to date. That's the massive reason. Failure to do things like reporting on the SMS and keeping all of that stuff up to date would be another, reason. So one of the things that happens in an inspection that's caused problems for people in the past is when they interview migrants. So again, this is very small text to fit it all on, but this is something that YWAM has put together for our inspections. So these are the typical questions that get asked of migrants when you have a UKVI inspector on site with you. So again, you'll get a copy of this. So we just basically earwigged at the door and listened in and then asked our migrants, what did you get asked about? And this is a summary of the typical questions that got asked, which when you read them, you'll see this is questions about the sponsor. So they're not interviewing a migrant to find out if they are a legitimate migrant in the country. They're asking if we're a legitimate sponsor. So does your sponsor let you take holidays? If yes, what's the process for being approved to take a holiday? So it's questions about the sponsor. And I think that made our migrants feel a bit less worried, that it wasn't about whether or not they would be sent home. But in another way, it increased their sense of anxiety about it, because it might mean the impact was quite large if they answered poorly and it reflected badly on us as a sponsor, that things would be affected. So we just, when we find out who they want to interview, because at least in our previous inspections, they told us who they wanted to interview so that they would be available. We just ran through this and did mock interviews with people and asked them the questions. Obviously, if you're doing your job as a sponsor, they should be able to answer a lot of this already. But this made a big difference in the level of confidence for our migrants going into those interviews, because they asked the sponsor to leave the room. So you're not there to sort of coach them along and answer for you. So yeah, next question. What tracking methods do you use for migrants that are not on a main site or working from home or traveling a lot? So this is another area that there have been a lot of questions asked about in the interviews, but it's massively unclear in the rules and in Appendix D what's required for this. So they don't ask you to keep a work schedule, but it might be smart to keep a work schedule so that you would have some kind of evidence to say, this is what they were doing at this time, and I would know how to track them down and find out if they were there. But I would just encourage everyone to make sure you have some system, whether that's regular reports that are filed or regular check-ins that need to happen that you can have evidence of, but to make sure you can prove you know that your migrants are doing the work that they've been brought in to do. YWAM at least mainly functions in teams, and we only have a few places where there would be 1s and 2s and 3s of people working outside of a team context. And that's, excuse me, the main way we track it is that we have, everyone works in a team. So I know if my teammate doesn't show up for the day or doesn't do the ministry that she's normally doing on Wednesday. One person sent in a question noting that a few of their visas had been denied due to financial reasons on the part of the migrant. And just to say, if you are an A-rated sponsor, you should be able to certify maintenance, which means that they don't have to prove their finances as part of their application. So unless you're unwilling to certify somebody's maintenance, I would recommend doing that to make sure that they don't have to prove it. Obviously, at least as YWAM, we know people can live on a lot less money than what the UK government says is the minimum required salary, especially in our situation where they're living in YWAM provided accommodation. Their rent fee would be much lower than to rent an apartment in the town. So yeah, I would just recommend certifying maintenance if you haven't been doing that. So somebody had a question about standard visitors and letting people come in as standard visitors. So separate to what we've already talked about in terms of what will be allowed, what we understand is that the UK government considers religious work. That's why it's a specific category. So we do need to have people get a work visa if they're genuinely coming to work for us. So even if they're allowed to come here for 6 months, like as a Canadian, I could come here for 6 months as a tourist, but that doesn't give me the right to work here. So just, yeah, to make sure that you're using that category correctly. We do allow standard visitors for like speakers for our training events. They're just coming for a week. Seminar participants. So if they're just coming in for a 2 or 3 day or even a 2-week seminar, they can come in as a tourist. There's, or a standard visitor, I should say. There's allowance for that. For short-term outreach teams that are based elsewhere, just coming to do an outreach as part of a program and then going back home again. Basically, as long as they're based somewhere else and just coming in temporarily, then they can come in for this under 30 days to do this kind of work stuff. But again, some of the visitor rules are changing from the first, so just to watch that space for what's allowed. Another person asked about calculating continuous residence period to qualify for indefinite leave to remain and whether or not tier 5 can be included in that. And it definitely can't. It's only time on tier 2 that will allow someone to qualify for indefinite leave to remain. We had another question about when does it make sense for a parachurch organization to be a sponsor for a church worker as opposed to supporting that church in getting their own sponsorship. And basically, whoever the person is actually working for needs to be the sponsor. So we have lots of YWAMers, for example, that have a YWAM role within a team, but then they also do youth work at a local church, but they're doing it as a YWAMer. So YWAM is the sponsor. But if that person is actually, as their primary role and function and kind of line of authority in terms of who they report to, being a youth worker at a church, the church should be the sponsor. So I think it's just sort of navigating that fine line between who are they actually working for, and that person should be the sponsor. Someone asked about what are the risks an organization incurs in becoming a visa sponsor. I didn't totally understand where that question was coming from. Obviously, there are fines if you employ someone illegally, so that's a risk. There are other non-compliance issues. So obviously, if you become a sponsor and you bring in a bunch of people and then you lose your license, that would be a massive inconvenience for your migrants who then will have to go home. So yeah, the loss of your license might also mean you bring in migrants and then you can't keep doing the work that you've been doing if they have to go home. But I didn't understand if they meant something more than that by risk. I assumed legal risk, but so just to ask that question again if you want something different. Another question, and I'm trying to roll through these, so there's a little bit of extra time here at the end for more Q&A. What is the process to get a migrant switched from tier 5 to tier 2 and the time scale with that? So generally speaking, people who come on a tier 5 for 2 years, they need to go home and apply for their tier 2 from their home country or their country of residence. So they might have the ability to live somewhere else. Generally, when we do that in YWAM, we recommend that they pass the English test here, that you get them their certificate organized and help them with any paperwork that they need here, and then they go home and submit the application from home. We try and think about that time in between, like a home assignment or a furlough. a chance for them to connect with family and their sending church and, supporters and that kind of thing. So we try and see that as a real benefit, that they get to go home rather than that they have to go home. Although obviously there's the cost of flights associated that makes that a bit higher. Practically speaking, if you're wanting to start having people on tier 2, you'll need to get that added to your sponsor license, and make sure that you're doing all the required reporting, making sure that you withdraw sponsorship when they leave, and then making sure all the certificates are issued and paperwork's given to them. During COVID, that was relaxed, as we talked about before, where you could switch in country. So in certain cases that is still allowed, but just to make sure you read the rules and know specifically which dates and which types of visas are currently allowed to switch in country. And the time scale, as previously discussed, it's a total mystery how long it will actually take for applications to go through, depending on the country and the time of year. What we find is that kind of July, August, September time, it's always slower then, because that's when all of the student visas, like for universities, are going through for their late September, early October start that a lot of universities have. So late summer, early autumn, that's always slower processing. But that's just by experience that we know that, rather than published. Yeah. Somebody asked about the difference between a charity worker and a religious worker. So a charity worker must be doing voluntary field work. So it must contribute directly to the achievement or advancement of the sponsor's charitable purpose. So that's trying to quote right from the website. So as listed on the Charities Commission, they have to be doing voluntary field work that meets those criteria, which for a lot of us, obviously that's then going to bump us into the religious categories, because we will have a religious charitable purpose. So with a charity worker, no payment is allowed or anything seen as a free benefit, apart from that you can provide them free accommodation. It does not allow for what's called work ancillary to the sponsor's charitable purpose. So we talked about that before. They can't do routine back office administrative roles, retail or other sales roles, fundraising roles, or roles involved in the maintenance of the sponsor's office and other assets. So maintenance, cleaning, gardening, that kind of thing. So that's what's not allowed on the charity worker. So then a religious worker visa, what's different about that is that they must be doing religious work and not primarily admin. So there isn't a published percentage of what has to be religious to qualify. So is it 10, is it 50, is it 100? We don't know. What I do know is that if I want to run a kids club at the church at the top of my street, I have to make flyers and deliver those flyers. And does that qualify as religious work? I can't run the kids club with religious teaching in it if I don't make a flyer on my computer. So obviously some stuff's allowed, it just can't be primarily admin. And with a religious worker, it can be pastoral or non-pastoral, but they are not allowed to be a clergy or a vicar or like a leader of a church. That's one specific thing that is not allowed. Clergy can only be a tier 2 minister of religion. So it's a pretty broad category. They include within that church worker, missionary, and monk or nun, remember, member of a religious order. So kind of there's the subcategories within both of the religious tier 2 and tier 5 ones. But so yeah, that's the difference between the charity worker and the religious worker. In a couple of circumstances, YWAM has used the charity worker visa for applicants from closed nations. So where it would look badly for them to have a religious visa in their passport. So we ran a school based intentionally recruiting Chinese people, and they all came on charity worker visas. As YWAM, for all of our training, we use religious worker visas, but I know YWAM in Northern Ireland, they're running their training on charity worker visas. So yeah, so it just depends on how you're interpreting the rules there, what is voluntary field work, and how you want to use that type of visa. And the last question that I'll go over ahead of time is, what are the differences between being a tier 5 sponsor and having both tier 2 and tier 5? And the answer is almost nothing. The record keeping requirements are exactly the same. The SMS requirements are exactly the same. The cost of the license is even exactly the same as having just a tier 5. So yeah, you really just need to make sure you have a distinction between your temporary and your permanent roles. But otherwise, it's virtually exactly the same in terms of requirements to have both. So yes, okay. So I don't actually know now in terms of screen sharing how I'm gonna have to stop sharing my screen and then open up the other document to check and see about questions there. Emma, I don't know if you wanna comment about any questions that have come through.
Sarah, if you want, stop sharing. Do you want me to share the document?
Yeah, actually, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay, can everybody see that? Yep, okay. So I've tried to go through and just bold the questions as they've been submitted. So answers to some have already been added. So question 3.
Yeah. So on the 244 clergy code, they must only do missions or church work. Can these people also help with admin roles as part of their time, for example? Yeah, so it's my understanding, as we were kind of just talking about, some admin is allowed. If somebody's on a tier 2 minister of religion and they are the head of a department, for example. So if you have the fancy title of national coordinator for visas and immigration for YWAM, I'm the lead of a department with 15 or 20 people that report back to me. I could do that full time as my tier 2 minister of religion because it's the lead of a department. So if it's the head of accounting, then they can do the admin. But otherwise, in both tier 2 and tier 5, with that clergy code, they must be doing mainly religious work. But again, I have no idea what percentage that is that they're expecting.
Okay. So probably what I'll say is I will go back through the recording and add in some more details to these responses rather than trying to do it all now.
Yeah. Perfect.
So I think question 4 is quite similar. Are there restrictions on what a missionary can do on code 2444?
So that example of sports, that one's a little bit tricky because there is a specific sports category. So I think probably what you need to be doing is reading the rules of what's allowed in the sports category versus what's allowed in the religious categories, and to see which one you land in. They do give a specific example in the tier 2 and tier 5 sponsor guidance that if you have a teacher teaching in a religious school, that's not a religious job, that's a teaching job. So it may be that that particular example, sports, should fall under the sporting category. It just depends on how the role is set up, I think.
Okay, thank you. Question 5.
Yeah, I don't know that I understand. So tier 5 religious workers only need 40 points, but also the higher salary. So the salary requirements aren't part of the tier 5 religious worker visa. So I'm not sure I understand the question. Does the person who asked that want to just clarify?
No.
No.
Well,
okay.
maybe if that person, whoever put that on, you can always go back in and sort of add a little bit extra detail into the question as we've moved on. So please feel free to do
or
that.
Or if it's already been answered too.
Yeah.
To just leave it.
Okay. Looks like question 6 has largely already been answered.
Yeah, scrapped from the 1st of January.
Okay, so we can move down, I think.
Andy, could we just scroll back up? Somebody said they thought it was being continued for tier 5. I haven't heard that, but I wouldn't. Yeah, so I don't know if it's going to continue on for tier 5. I haven't heard that it is. I've heard it's being scrapped completely. But everyone will just sort of have to keep paying attention from the 1st of December to see if it's still in the rules for tier 5 religious workers.
Okay, it looks like question 7 has been.
Yeah, so the immigration
answered.
surcharge is just the new deterrent for preferring migrant workers over British workers.
Okay. Question 7b has just proved my inability to count to more than 10 or less than 10.
Yeah, so if a worker is supernumerary, can they easily get their personal support from the USA to the UK, i.e. as a monthly payment, etc.? Where do they pay tax? So that depends largely on the country that they're from. I fundraise through Canada. My husband is American, so he fundraises through the States. As a Canadian, after 5 years, I could fill out a form to say I don't live there anymore. And now I don't file taxes in Canada. I only file taxes here. But America has different tax laws for their citizens, and my husband still has to file in the States. And the States, well, they have the worst tax laws ever, really. But personal opinion. But yeah, they still want a bite of the cherry for all of my husband's income, even though, yeah, he doesn't live there and hasn't done for 12 years. So it depends on the country. We find it pretty easy. I just make a transfer through PayPal for mine. Everyone finds a different way depending on how much support you have and where, if it can be done through a bank transfer or PayPal or like a TransferWise kind of site. But yeah, we know that the tax rules, for somebody like YWAM, the tax rules are complicated because we are all considered, with YWAM, what we do is we say everyone should be considered self-employed. So if you're here for more than 186 days, you need to register in the British system. You need to get a unique taxpayer code and you get registered with the self-assessment system, and you must file if you live here for more than 186 days under the self-employed self-assessment part of the website. So we ask all YWAMers that are here for 6 months or more to get into the system, to get a national insurance number and to be a part of the British system. So for most of them are filing twice, once in their home country and once here. But okay, you should only pay, there's double taxation laws in a lot of places, so you should only pay in one place. And lots of church workers and missionaries, let's be honest, we are under the minimum to pay anything anyway. So, yeah.
Lovely, thank you. The new question 9, it looks like that has already been answered.
Yes, yeah, you should still be able to use the charity worker visa.
Okay, oh, I've just noticed a word, so biometrics. So if I just skip back up here, somebody asked or made a comment. Oh yeah, there we go. So I'm confused, initially said no biometrics for Europeans. Not
doing it on site. They still have to do it, but it will be digital. So just to clarify that, they will still have to do the biometrics for their visa applications, but they'll get to do it digitally.
Okay, thank you.
That's my understanding.
Looks like question 9 has been answered.
Yeah, that is a complicated one. And so it is true, people can be self-funded, but you really have to drill down into the national minimum wage rules. And I can see if I can find my little link in my policy manual for my teams about where to find that you don't have to pay people and that they can be self-funded, which means you don't have to meet the minimum wage. That is a little bit complicated, and you have to really want to know that to be able to show that in the rules.
Right, thank you. Looks like question
10 we've answered.
10 has been answered, and question 11.
Oh, this is back to the paying. How do you not pay your missionaries? Everybody is self-funded. So everyone raises their own support from churches and individuals that are known to them. So in YWAM, we have a a value of everyone doing relationship-based fundraising. So most of our people, it's through people that they know rather than getting a grant or a trust to support them in some way. It should be relationship. So yeah, so all of our missionaries that serve with us are on our sponsor license if they're from abroad. The supernumerary means they are all surplus, but they all need sponsoring. So yeah, supernumerary just means we can take 10 if 10 apply and are qualified, or we can take 5 or 20. So the number of people we have, it's not specific roles that we're recruiting for. So if someone wants to come and start a kids ministry, they can do that, or be part of our training program, or kind of whatever role. So that's what it means to be surplus, or supernumerary, I should say. But all of those people still have to be sponsored by us.
Okay, great, thank you. Question 12.
Yeah, this is awkward. This is a really awkward place for YWAM as well. Volunteers helping in a mainly maintenance role, can they be sponsored on the religious worker tier 5? That is a hard one, because is maintenance religious work? So we may be able to look at that and say, we do everything as unto the Lord. And from our perspective, yes, that could be religious work. But to an immigration officer doing an inspection on your files, and they see that the person is just doing maintenance and mowing the lawn and fixing buildings, I would seriously doubt that they would qualify that as religious work. So as YWAM, we say no, either they can't do that full time, they have to have some religious work added in. So it just can't be their full-time thing. So we had to shift that when they changed the rules on what was allowed and what wasn't a few years ago. So yeah, I would say by my reading of the rules, no, someone full-time maintenance cannot be a religious worker.
Okay, thank you. Question 13, another one about unpaid roles. Not sure if we've already covered that one. So
yeah, you don't have to pay them, but you do have to sponsor them.
Okay. Question 14 looks like that has been answered.
Yeah, both tier 5 charity worker and religious worker can be unpaid.
Okay. Question 15.
Yeah, the standard visitor visa. Yeah, Emma's written here some of the things. We just make sure that they meet all the requirements of what they have to prove their finances, that they have a return ticket, maybe a letter from you saying what they're doing. But yeah, I'm happy to send out. So one of the things I've done in the past that I'm happy to do again is I create a visa manual for YWAM for all of our teams to use. And then every couple of times that I produce it, I de-YWAM it, and then we give it out to Global Connections people to use in whatever way they want. And I am in the process of editing a current visa manual that will hopefully come out next month. It will take me a little while to de-YWAM it, but everyone is welcome to have a copy of it to use as much of or as little as you like. But we can send a copy of our standard visitor letter with the PowerPoint.
Really appreciate that, Sarah. Thank you. Nipping down to question 16.
Oh yeah,
So,
I would have to Google it the same as everybody. I don't have it saved anywhere because I haven't actually applied for a license before. Since I started the role, we've only been doing renewals. So yeah, that would just be, I would Google it the same as anybody else. Maybe Tim Herbert or Hebert, I can't remember now. You have just recently done this. I don't know if you have that information off the top of your head to share in the chat, maybe, or in this document.
Okay.
Are there any changes in the definition of the tier 2 minister religion and tier 5 religious worker categories? Are they staying the same? As far as I know, they're staying the same, apart from the changes with resident labor market test. The definitions and the rules for them are, as far as I've seen, staying the same.
Okay, I see somebody's just put the link in.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you very much. Question 18.
Oh, this I'm not sure about. I don't know very much about the student routes. I know there are some changes with short-term study, but I'm not familiar with them. Yeah, so
Okay.
sorry, I don't have much to say about that one.
Question 19.
Link for the paperwork when you have the visa but can't come yet. So the link for that, where I get that information, it's the link for the advice to either sponsors or applicants about the pandemic changes. I'm assuming that's what you're talking about. So they, in the information that they've published about that, that's where I found one of the paragraphs just talk about if you've got a visa but you haven't come to the UK yet. It's just in that section. So the link is on the COVID page in the PowerPoint where I found that. And I don't know about how that reason goes compared to other reasons. I would say they just need to explain it to the helpline and go from there.
Oh, and the link has just appeared.
Yep, perfect.
Thank you very much. Calling off period, that's been responded to. 21.
So we can't do it consecutive anymore. Just to clarify, that isn't allowed now that that's what we had to change at that point. So, and a tier 5 can be extended if you come only for 6 months to begin with, you can extend it up to 2 years. So that's what I meant by extending a tier 5. So it's only if you didn't automatically get the 2 years to begin with.
Brilliant, thank you. Looks like question 22 has been answered.
Yeah.
23, the guarantee letter.
Yeah. So there is one, Andy. I'm guessing you've got a copy of it somewhere, but I can send it to you again. One of my old manuals is the most recent, like 2018 maybe, is the last one that I DYWAM'd and made sort of more accessible for broader groups. That can be sent around, and that's got our guarantee letter in it. It's a good starting point. Anyone can use it and edit it however suits you, really. But yeah, I'm happy to share our guarantee letters.
Thank you very much. 24.
Yeah, so the volunteering, as of today, they can do incidental volunteering. So it can't be their primary reason for coming. So if they're coming to volunteer with you, they need to have a work visa. The government considers religious work, which needs a visa. So if they're coming for another reason, they could do a few days up to 30 with you incidentally, as long as it's initiated by them and that you don't have any like expectation on them really. But there is, we think it's changing that they will be allowed to do 30 days of volunteering as their main reason of coming, but not more than 30. So, yeah.
So does that kind of cover 25 as well?
Yeah, so the link for that is in the slide that I gave with the 4 main immigration links. If you go to the top one is immigration rules. And I think if it's the very bottom, right near the bottom, but the visitor rules, that's where I got that from. So if you just open up those rules and then do a search for the word incidental, it should come up. But I think it's appendix, within the visitor rules, it's appendix 3, a paragraph 5 or something. I only know that because I was reading this yesterday.
Okay, I can see somebody's just adding a little extra content into 24.
Yep. So I would say, and what YWAM does is that a 10-day missions trip, they could come as standard visitors because they're based elsewhere. They're not going to be paid, and they're definitely going home at the end of it. Nobody's coming here trying to take a job. So as YWAM, we would allow a 10-day mission trip without getting a work visa and just being a standard visitor.
Okay. Is there a cutoff to the number of days, Sarah?
It's not really specific in the rules, but we try and keep it under a month because we feel like that's defendable within the context of different numbers like the 30 days. And if it's over that, I guess it just depends on their intention for coming. If it is genuinely, so we ran recently a 6-week seminar and we allowed those people to come because they were all part of other YWAM bases and they were just coming for some specific training and then returning to their YWAM base. So we did allow that. So we try and stick to somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks, but that's not in the rules anywhere. That's just what YWAM does because we feel like we could defend that in an inspection.
Okay, thank you. Oh, we've got more text coming in.
Yeah, so there used to be the tourist visa and the business visitor visa, and now it's all called standard visitor visa. And there are categories within that. So coming here to get married, coming here to donate an organ, coming here to do some short-term business related things. So it's all laid out in the visitor visa rules, what's allowed for people to do for work related things. But there are specifically allowances for temporary religious work on a standard visitor visa. So that's why a missions trip for 10 days by Americans would completely be allowed. They're coming in to do religious work, but they're not staying and they're not being paid.
Okay. I think there's further clarification being requested.
Yeah, so the standard visitor system as it is now, I think it started 2 or 3 years ago, maybe.
Okay.
It's been like that. So yeah, that's current rules.
Okay.
But they are changing some of the standard visitor rules from the 1st of January. But I don't know exactly if it means for just Europeans or for everybody, for some of them.
Okay. Right, I'm going to nip down to 26 and we can come back up to 24. Don't want to put pressure on people to type quickly. So question 26.
Yeah, so there's a limit on the amount of volunteering that can happen. Currently, it can only be incidental. So it can't be their main reason for coming. So that word incidental is everything in our understanding about what's allowed. So they're talking about removing that word, but putting a 30-day limit on for the visitor visa. So that's why the government says religious work is work. They have to have a work visa.
Okay. And 27.
Yeah, so yeah, that's absolutely, you have to have all that stuff in place. Yeah.
Okay.
Because the supernumerary just means you can have as many workers as you want, not that they're doing whatever they want. So it just means everybody is extra. So it just depends on how you set up the function of your organization. I've seen a few on the chat feature, a couple of things coming up about the charity worker. So I had said the tier 5 visas could be 12 or 24 months, but the charity worker is only 12 months maximum. Just to say, There's been a few questions popping up on the chat there.
Brilliant. And there was just one extra question of clarification on question 24. Where can we find that in the guidance?
Yeah, so in the PowerPoint, when you get it, on the page with 4 links, the very top one is immigration rules. And if you just scroll down till you see the visitor rules, it's all in there. So just follow that link.
Brilliant. Okay. I think that is all of the questions. Oh no, we've got an extra one in there.
So again, this depends on how you set up your role. So as YWAM, the way we do it is everybody pretty much comes in on a tier 5 to begin with. In certain circumstances, if they have like 10 years experience and they're making a new, like a lifetime commitment to Wales, for example, I am giving a tier 2 to one family because they're moving here permanently. So not to start on a tier 5, but generally speaking, we start everybody on a tier 5 and then they switch to a tier 2. But there's nothing that's stopping you from starting them on a tier 2 if they're going to be here for 5 years. So that just depends on the priorities of your and how your organization wants to function. But there's nothing that stops you from starting with a tier 2. We just find YWAM's very transient and lots of young people who won't make a long commitment. So that's just where some of our policy has come through.
Great, thank you. I think we've got another one, sponsor question from John. Does anyone have a bank recommendation?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that one, to be honest. Yeah, that one I'm not sure about. Mark Venning, one of my other colleagues, is on the call and he might better be able to answer that. Mark, I don't know if you're still online. I can't see all the pictures of everybody.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah, so Mark is typing something there now.
There you go. Thank you. I guess if anybody else has got any any other suggestions, then please feel free to add them to the.
Where do migrants pay tax? Just in the same place as everybody else. All our migrants are registered as self-employed, so they file through the self-assessment system. Can someone join your organization to serve under charity worker visa and their time be fulfilling an educational placement in their home country? So my understanding with all the visa types is that they can do other things. They can have part-time education and part-time jobs, supplementary or secondary employment, but they still have to be meeting the requirement of the number of hours you've got them the visa on in the first place. So with YWAM, everyone has to do 40 hours a week. So as long as they're still doing their 40 hours, they can do other stuff, but they have to be meeting the requirements. So in some cases, we might lower that temporarily for a course down to 30. I don't know how low you can go. I think we've only gone as low as 30, but you can lower the number of hours temporarily that someone's expected to work. But that would be down to, yeah, what's allowed within your charity, if that's okay or not.
Okay. It looks like there are a couple more questions that have been added but have already been responded to. So I think the last one down the bottom, regarding self-funded and
so
self-employed.
The Tier 2 Minister of Religion, all of ours are considered self-employed. Yeah.
Is there another one cropping up?
Yeah, so just, it will depend on their home country, how the home country taxes that income. So for example, with YWAM Canada, I fundraise through one of the teams in YWAM Canada. So my Canadian supporters send it there and get their tax benefit through that. And then they deposit that money into my bank account. And then I bring that over for myself. And then I just claim that on my British tax. But because I don't have to file in Canada anymore, Canada doesn't track any of that. They have to report it through the Canada base. But because I've registered that I don't live there anymore. But in America, we have, again, an American base that we fundraise through. And my husband has to file taxes in America and file taxes here with that income listed in two places. So he files on the same income in both countries.
Right.
But that's just the rules of America and Canada. I can't speak to all of the nations. But yeah, it's a complicated thing for a lot of missionaries handling taxes. And then my Brazilian, she doesn't file taxes at all in Brazil. And it seems sort of hit and miss if she did before anyway, when she lived there. So some countries don't have really specific rules.
So I can only hope that has been very helpful and useful. I think we've got through a massive amount of content and answered an awful lot of questions. So thank you all for contributing and for submitting those questions, because I think it's very often that one person asks the question that 20 other people are thinking. So yeah, hopefully we've managed to cover everything that people want to. So just to underline, we will share that document, obviously, once we've sort of prettified it a little, and then because the recording will be shared around as well, you'll be able to go back and sort of review the discussion and the responses that Sarah has provided. So you can do that at your own leisure. So I think, given the time as it is, that just leaves me to kind of wrap things up. So I think first and foremost, I hope that you will all join me in expressing my sincere gratitude to Sarah, not only for the time that you have spent this morning, Sarah, but I know the time that you've spent preparing all this, pulling all the content together, and dedicated to share a vast amount of knowledge and experience. So I can see a few hand claps going around very quietly. But yeah, thank you very much on behalf of the network for giving us your time and expertise. We are very, very grateful. Thank you from me for all of you for contributing and just providing yet more value to the network, and proving where the real strength is in the network. We support each other, so that's really good to see. As I've already said, we will send around the link to the recording, to any associated documents that we've discussed this morning, along with the evaluation form. So we would please encourage you to complete that evaluation form and submit it back. We do want to learn how to do things better, and to meet your needs. So if you do think at any point of other things that you want us to respond to try and find answers to, then please do get in contact with us. We do want to meet the needs of the network, so yeah, please do that. And then yeah, keep an eye out on the website for anything that's coming up. We do have a few other bits and pieces in the pipeline, so yeah, please do keep an eye out for that. So if there's nothing else, then we'll close this up. I think we'll close in prayer, and then bid you all a fond farewell. So before we go, let's pray. Father God, we do thank you for being with us this morning. We thank you for the stability of technology, and I'm sure that you've had your hand in that. So we are so grateful, and we are so grateful, Lord, for the experience and the knowledge that you have given to Sarah, and her willingness to come and share that with the rest of us. So may you bless her for the time and the effort she's put into this. And I pray, Lord, that for each of us, that you would help us to take away and use effectively what we have learned this morning, for your glory and for your purpose and your will. So we ask and pray, Lord, your blessing upon each and every one, that we may serve you with all our strength and with all our might for your glory. We ask and pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.